Starting us off tonight is Preet Bharara. He's the former U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York. It's great to be here with you. You've been in these courtrooms. You know what it's like to have this strategy.
From time to time.
So let's just start with your big takeaway from the events of today.
Look, I think it's important to take a moment, like you did in your intro, to consider what an extraordinary situation this is. After all the delays, after all the whining, after all the motion practice, with 3 of the 4 cases delayed, some because of the Supreme Court, some because of an ethics question in Georgia, you have an actual criminal case that's proceeding. You might say you have finally, eventually, the peaceful transition to accountability, which is not a small thing. You have literally a defendant with Secret Service agents to protect him in tow in a Manhattan courtroom in state court facing the music, and also finding it reportedly so mundane, or maybe he's so tired from preparation that he closed his eyes and apparently maybe fell asleep. That's a big deal, you know, because people have been concerned that accountability is not forthcoming. It is here, and, you know, he was the former President of the United States, Commander-in-Chief. He may be again. He's aspiring to that again. But he couldn't hide in some oligarch's cabin somewhere. He doesn't have his own army. And the fact that he can be brought to justice in the United States of America, notwithstanding his former standing and his potential future standing, I think says something good and right about the rule of law.
Yes, the slow wheels of justice, but they started today, and we can feel good about that. I went through some of this, and I think a lot of us are trying to figure out what to make of it. I mean, because there was a lot of discussion about what evidence was admissible and what evidence was not. So I want to go through some of that and just see how it struck you. The Access Hollywood tape I mentioned. So they can't play the tape, but they can use the transcript. Why? And what does that mean?
So that's a good question. And I have the same question. It's a little bit peculiar. I mean, one thing you have to realize that in all cases, but certainly in a case that the whole world is watching and scrutinizing, and will be especially scrutinized by an appellate court if there's a conviction here, is that the judge wants to tread carefully and make sure that his rulings are sound and within his discretion, and he's never found to have abused his discretion. And, you know, one could have argued, I think not poorly, that the entire Access Hollywood business should not have come in.
At all.
You could make the argument, Trump's team made the argument, even though it's probative, for the idea that they were so freaked out by this tape that came out, they wanted to quell, you know, disclosure of this relationship, so they made the payoff. I think a judge could have decided not to let that in for fear of that being something that was reversible on appeal. What I don't understand, and I think lay people and lawyers alike don't fully understand, is, you know, what is the prejudicial difference between allowing in the transcript and every single word that was uttered versus the tape? In fact, because the tape itself doesn't have, it's not a videotape of Donald Trump, it's an audio tape. So they have one but not the other. I'm not sure why that makes a lot of sense.
I guess I feel better that there's not a clarity of answer there.
He was giving one, he was giving one to the defense, and the record will show, and we'll go through some of the other things you might ask me about in a second. When a record shows that a judge seems to be going down the middle and finding in his or her discretion, for the prosecution sometimes, for the defense sometimes, that sets a record on appeal of showing that this person wasn't single-mindedly trying to screw the defense or screw the prosecution or vice versa. So I think it's a reasonably good record so far.
The other piece, and it was the Michael Cohen of it all, which feels like the Michael Cohen of it all could be a theme of the next several weeks, where some testimony and guilty plea was allowed, but they can't imply Trump is guilty just because Cohen was, which again, to a layperson and a non-lawyer, you're thinking, wait, Michael Cohen went to jail for this thing that Trump actually participated in. How is that not the case, and how is that not admissible in court?
Well, the fact that the guilty plea is admissible for other reasons, but it's long been a black letter law that just because someone else in a conspiracy has pled guilty to something, you don't want that to be imputed to the person who's on trial, right? You have to separately prove in a separate proceeding with separate, trial evidence and separate witnesses that the person who's on trial is guilty. But it does have arguably some spillover effect, because jurors, although it can't be argued to the jury, jurors will say, well, wait a minute, you have a nucleus of facts about which this other person was convicted and found guilty in some other court. That means that a crime was committed, and they might think this maybe applies to Trump, but they're going to be I think instructions to the jury that they can't consider that for that purpose, and the judge rightly determined under the law that you can't consider that for that purpose. But it's a double-edged sword, right? Because on the one hand, maybe it's helpful to prosecutors because some guy was convicted of a crime that maybe proves that there was a crime. On the other hand, there's a witness who was convicted of a crime. And among the crimes he was convicted of was lying. And who are you going to believe now? This lying witness who's convicted. So I think it's a big question about how Michael Cohen will be perceived.
I mean, Donald Trump had the sex the hush money was paid for. As an average non-lawyer person, as how I read it. But we will see how this all plays out. I want to ask you about jury selection. That was obviously a big part of the factor today. You have been a big part of jury selection in the past. There's a lot of strategy involved here. There's a couple of things that happened that stuck out. I mean, half the first panel of 96 prospective jurors was dismissed after they said they could not be fair and impartial. They could have lied. Maybe they're being honest. Of course, that's a good thing. There's also a jury questionnaire that was lengthy and asked a lot of questions about people's media consumption. Did anything stick out to you about the questionnaire or the number of people who recused themselves today?
I think it's a down-the-middle questionnaire. I think, most of the questions of the 42 were agreed upon by consensus by both the prosecution and the defense. There's a subset of questions that there was no agreement on, and the judge, I think, made a good determination about what those questions should be and how they should be phrased. You don't usually see scores of people in the first round say they can't be fair. You said something a second ago that I think is worthy of further comment. Presumably there are dozens of people in the jury veneer in the pool who don't like Donald Trump, don't want him to become president, could have decided, well, I'm going to sort of fake my way into the jury, say I'm going to be fair, and be part of the process that convicts Donald Trump, because maybe it'll hurt him some way politically or otherwise. And they didn't do that. And the fact that you have such a significant number of people who decided, I'm not going to be part of something that's not appropriate, I'm just going to, absent myself, I think is a good sign about the potential fairness of the trial. Yeah,
that's interesting, and a very interesting take, so I want to talk to you about it. There's a ruling next week on the gag order, and I think the gag order, it's this big question of like $1,000 for each tweet. If they're not going to put him in jail, which seems unlikely, is that really going to prevent him from attacking people in this case he shouldn't be attacking, like the judge's family, people? What do you think?
I think the gag order is a little bit of a sideshow. There's not a lot of teeth in the gag order. Donald Trump, it would be a big deal for the judge to put Donald Trump in prison for a day or 2 days or 3 days. So he comes up to the edge, crosses over it a little bit, sips a toe over it. I think the real main show is the evidence that's going to be presented at trial. And I think, it's a difficult thing to be a juror in this case. So that if Donald Trump steps over the line with respect to jurors, which I think he won't do, he's not that stupid, then you'll see, I think, a conflagration. But when he does this sort of, parrying and making fun of people around the judge's circle or the court, which specifically he's allowed to do, I think he'll get away with it.
Lachlan Cartwright joins me now. He's, of course, the former executive editor of the National Enquirer. He's now special correspondent for The Hollywood Reporter. This is such a fascinating piece. I was just telling you, I also listened to your piece on The Daily and heard you talk through it. A lot of people don't even know that this is what happens out there. But I want to start with what I just read. You clearly have been paying very close attention to this case. You know the details very well. You're going to be in the courtroom, I believe. And as someone very intimately aware of the contours here, what do you hope people understand?
Fundamentally, Jen, this is a case about election interference. And I understand people are focusing on a payoff to a porn star. But fundamentally here, this is a case about election interference. We go back to a meeting that took place in August of 2015 with the person I used to work for, David Pecker, where he's with Michael Cohen, and he says, I will be the eyes and ears of the campaign. My organisation will purchase negative stories off the market, and we will run negative stories on your rivals. Now, that is something I did not know in real time when I was the executive editor of The Enquirer, when we were orchestrating operations such as what happened with Dino Sajudin, where we were trying to stand up this tip about Trump having a love child, and then suddenly the order came to stand down, and we paid him $30,000, and that story never saw the light of day. But ultimately, this organization, this media organization, you've been around politics long enough to know that it's not unusual for a media organization to do favors for a political candidate or a campaign. But this is the first time in American democracy, certainly that I'm aware of, that a media organization twists itself into a criminal enterprise to help get a candidate elected. And that is what went on here, and that is fundamentally what this case is about.
And that is such an important part of this story, because it's not just about this one particular case. That's what we hear in the courtroom. It's also about the media organization you used to work for really pushing negative stories about a number of people who are Trump's rivals. I mean, stories about his 2016 primary rivals, Ted Cruz, Ben Carson, as well as a slew of negative stories about Hillary Clinton. We all remember kind of these covers, or many of us do. Talk about how basically, and you've touched on it a little bit, this whole entire media organization was set up to protect a single candidate.
Yeah, I mean, I've come from tabloids, in the UK. I worked for the Murdochs for many years, both at The Sun and the New York Post. I'm used to tabloid journalism. This wasn't that. Certainly did not. It merged itself into basically a propaganda arm where we went from reporting on celebrities or mass shootings, true crime, which is the bread and butter, as is celebrity divorces, and suddenly we're now running stories. Hillary has 3 months to live, and we're lining up.
I remember that one.
Pseudo experts to analyze pictures of her looking frail, and our art department is ginning up these images to make her look in poorer health than she was. And it was week after week after week, as one of Trump's rivals was up in the polls, whether it was Ted Cruz or someone else, we would be running a negative story. And say what you will about the Inquirer, the reach of this publication, it's on supermarket shelves in every Walmart, in every airport, and that real estate was being weaponized by AMI to help get Trump elected. And that is what, Alvin Bragg is talking about in this statement of facts, in this indictment. And that's what I think people sort of pass over a little bit when we talk about falsifying business records. Fundamentally, this was a plot, an agreement to influence the 2016 election, and it worked.
And this is, again, so important because, I mean, I've worked obviously in the side of media when you're working for campaigns, right? And earned media, as they say, magazine covers that are on grocery store shelves, that is gold to people, the visuals of what they're seeing. So we learned today that the judge will allow National Enquirer covers to be admissible in court. We just showed a few of them, including the Hillary Clinton is dying cover. Are there some that you think are important for people to see? Are there some that, you think would particularly make that point?
It's the pattern. It's the pattern to look through what this publication was publishing when I first joined in 2014, when it was, it was Jen and Ben, or it was, Tom Cruise, or it was that kind of mix of celebrity content. And then to look at how this publication then became, as I said, a propaganda tool for the Trump organization, that, it was Hillary that was dying every other week. It was Ted Cruz's father is involved with Lee Harvey Oswald. It was, every other politician is suddenly, there's a negative story. And that, again, the catch and kills everyone focuses on, and I get that obsession. But it is looking at how this publication was weaponized and becoming a propaganda tool of the Trump organization. I think that pattern here is incredibly important.
One of the things that's striking to me about all of this is that you've decided to put yourself out there. I mean, you had an NDA.
Which I'm publicly breaking.
Which you're publicly breaking. We all know that there can be threats and even violence.
Which I've experienced.
Which you've experienced. Talk to me a little about that and how you considered that when you decided to be as public as you have been in telling a very personal story.
I've wanted to tell this story for some years. For a couple of reasons. Firstly, as a journo, it is a cracking yarn, but it is a story of national importance. And secondly, I, as someone who has been pursued, over the years because of, my help to media organizations as a source, which is an important part of the New York Times piece, is when I revealed that I was a source for a lot of these organizations, getting out in real time with the Wall Street Journal on the eve of the election, helping get the Karen McDougal story out into the public domain. But I also wrote this story for anyone that is in a tight spot, that is having the screws turned on them to know that, at some point they're going to be able to get to the other side of it. And that's what I was able to do. I was able to, after several years, to get to the other side of this. And David Pecker and Dylan Howard, who have written me, a number of very intense legal threats, threatening $5 million lawsuits, I'll be down at court and I'll be able to look them in the eyes and think, I've got out the other side of this, and you blokes are here testifying about, these matters. And so, I wanted to tell this story for some years, and I'm glad that I had this opportunity.
As Donald Trump's first criminal trial began today in New York City, I couldn't help but think about the remarkable split screen the country is watching play out in real time. It is a presidential election year. On the left, you have Donald Trump, the former commander-in-chief, seated on the defense side of a Manhattan courtroom. On the right, you have the current commander-in-chief, President Biden, in the actual Situation Room, overseeing the response to an Iranian attack against Israel. That's a split screen. Over the next 6 weeks, the contrast between the two candidates running for president is going to be stark. We don't know how Americans will digest it, but it will be quite a difference between the guy sitting in the courtroom and the guy governing the country. Joining me now is Democratic Congressman Dan Goldman of New York. Before getting to Congress, he was an assistant U.S. attorney in the Southern District of New York. He is also a former colleague of District Attorney Alvin Bragg and Donald Trump's defense attorney, Todd Blanche. That would be quite a dinner party I would like to attend with you. So let me start here, Congressman, because one of the things that struck me about today is that, there's this perception out there that this trial, or there has been, is somehow the most politically helpful to Donald Trump, that it is advantageous to him. But I was kind of impressed by the storytelling a bit and all of the details that were discussed today, some of which I'd even forgotten about. And in a recent poll, 64% of voters say the charges in the hush money trial are at least somewhat serious. We'll see. We don't know how it will impact voters. But if you were talking to a voter, you're an elected official, you're a politician, but you are a former prosecutor, what would you say to them about why this case matters to them?
This case matters because it's about our democracy. It's about whether or not our elections are going to be free and fair and decided ultimately by the people based on the rule of law and election law. And what Donald Trump is alleged to have done is to pay off not one but two potential different women to silence them from coming out with very damaging information in the weeks before the election. And you'll recall there was that famous Access Hollywood tape, which received significant attention, and Donald Trump received significant blowback for it. So it was clear that if there was one more thing that came out about his poor behavior, so to speak, misconduct with women or otherwise, that would have a damaging effect. And so in order to avoid that, he paid off a porn star, Stormy Daniels, in order to keep her quiet. But he did it in an illegal scheme to cover it up so that no one would know that he did it, and he did it to avoid campaign finance laws. And so you're going to see a sort of summary of all of these things, but this goes to the core heartland of what our elections are about, which is that transparency and following the rule of law is essential to our democracy having free and fair elections.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a through line among some of these cases, which I think often people forget. I want to ask you about these two. You worked with Manhattan DA Alvin Bragg. You also worked with Todd Blanche. I joked about a dinner party. That's not going to happen. But what should people like to project onto these prosecutors, who they are, or the defense attorneys? What should people know or understand about each of them, their style, their strengths, as they're watching this trial unfold?
Well, the great thing about being a prosecutor is I had no idea what their political leanings may have been when we were prosecutors together. We didn't discuss it. That is not what a prosecutor's job is. They are both true professionals. DA Bragg will treat this case with the respect that the justice system deserves. He will only speak through his prosecutors in court and court documents. You will not see any press conferences. He will not politicize this. He will let the facts and the evidence speak as to whether they are applied sufficiently to the law to get a conviction. And Todd Blanche is also a professional. He's been a defense lawyer for a while, was an excellent prosecutor, and I think you will see much better defense lawyering from Mr. Blanche than you may have seen in the civil case that Donald Trump had a couple months ago.
I also wanted to ask you just about the jury selection process. We all learned a lot. I became fascinated by the jury selection process today. Who knew? Did anything stick out to you about the number of people who pulled themselves out of it, or the length of the questionnaire? Anything surprising to you?
Well, it's always interesting when people self-select their own biases. I've sat for jury duty as a former prosecutor, and I actually had a judge ask me, say, are you sure you can be fair and impartial? Which I found insulting. Of course I can be fair and impartial. Just because I'm a prosecutor does not mean that I can't look at the facts and the evidence like anybody else would. And so I wonder who is actually pulling him or herself out because of bias. Is it bias against Trump? Is it bias for Trump? It's very hard to tell. But I am glad that there will be an exhaustive voir dire of the jurors, because I do think that the sanctity of the jury pool is going to be vital in this trial. This is going to be a model for many Americans as to how criminal trials work, how our country's rule of law operates, and how no person, whether the former president or anyone else, is above the law. Donald Trump will be treated as any other defendant will be. All of his politicization and his partisanship and his campaigning outside of the courtroom will not be allowed in the courtroom. The only thing that will come in will be facts and evidence according to the rule of law, and these jurors will ultimately decide whether or not the evidence proves beyond a reasonable doubt that Donald Trump committed these crimes. That's what our great system is based on. And so now that the trial is actually beginning, as someone who did a number of trials, I'm excited for the American people to actually see how this process should work and why it should apply to Donald Trump and everyone else in this country, no matter their stature or power.
He walked down the same hallway, sat in the same chair as other defendants, which stuck out to me today. Congressman Dan Goldman, thank you so much for making time for us this evening.
Hey, everyone. MSNBC has a new and improved app. You'll get real-time alerts and analysis, live blogs, in-depth essays, video highlights, and the best 2024 election coverage. Download the new MSNBC app. Here's how to do it. You tap on the App Store on your phone. You hit search on the bottom right corner. You type in MSNBC. You click on the MSNBC app. You click on Get or the cloud icon and enjoy it.